You're listening to Magic from Wherever I'm At with your host, the magician, time traveler, and charmer, Dartagnan.
Welcome to another edition of the podcast, and here we are at episode 86, The Bad. Now, in the first episode of this three-part series, I talked about the part I thought was the best aspect of the Magic Rainbow book by Juan Tamariz, that having to do with these 7 veils, and I think that was the most important part for me I got out of the book, primarily because these are the things that audience members actually intrinsically understand or feel, and they may not know why exactly, but they do feel these things, and that causes their reactions and their like and dislike to be altered, because it's this constant representation of how much the magician is really into this. And when you steal other people's presentations, or you plagiarize, or when you don't put any work in anything, when you're not really in love with magic, you're just in love with tricks, all these things come across. And those 7 veils to me were a great representation of what is at play there for people who claim to love magic, but then don't actually do any of the work. They just continue to be like Gollum, and they just covetous of the ring, you know. That's how they treat tricks. But in this second part, which I've entitled The Bad, this book was largely a disappointment for me, because I was hoping there would be some really interesting insights for me into why Tamariz has what I would call weak presentations. I was really hoping that for some reason, and I would say he has defined why in this book, why his presentations I don't find particularly compelling. And I don't think he's a master of presentation in any way, shape, or form. I think Tamariz's impact on the art almost solely comes from a technical aspect. And that is the way the tricks are constructed and the moments of which, now there's some verbal dodgery and stuff which he offers in this book, which I think is perfectly acceptable and fine and good. And I think for me, probably, I've seen a lot of these ploys at work in the work of people like Danny D'Artes and some of the other Spanish magicians who, of course, Tamariz has heavily impacted. So this book has come out years after I've already been aware of some of these dodges and some of these approaches. So that's why some of that stuff maybe didn't land as much on me as it would somebody else who's never read that stuff for the first time. And then I just think someone like Danny D'Artes especially has taken what he's learned from Tamariz and melded it with the chaos of Leonard Green and some of the other people who's influenced him, and taken it to a whole new level. And he's a much better performer than Tamariz is, in my opinion. I've never considered Tamariz one of the best performers. I've almost always considered him someone who is really informing and influencing the technical side of magic, but not the actual performance side. There's only a few of his tricks which really ever resonated with me on any level. And most of the people in magic who consider Tamariz this fantastic, greatest magician or stuff they laud onto him, I think it's because these people are tricksters themselves. I mean, there's certainly people he's friendly with who continue to laud him with all sorts of plaudits and so forth. But mostly it's the people who are in the magic community who I feel they're not into it as deep as people who actually perform for a living and stuff. And so that's where this raising up of his stature has come from. I mean, I perform professionally basically every day if I'm not on vacation or something. And it's difficult for me to even attempt to figure out. There's certainly been ways in which Tamariz has made its way into my work, but it's hard to decipher exactly where that is, whereas I can immediately tell you where Vernon has impacted me, where Tommy Wonder has impacted me. And I also think there's, to some degree, because Tamariz is so card heavy, and a lot of these Spanish magicians are very card heavy through the influence of Tamariz, is I really think that that doesn't speak to me as much as to what a magician is, because a magician, I think, should pick up whatever and be able to do something with it, because the magician, you know, supposedly he has magical powers, so why is it restricted to card tricks? So I have a bias against people who only do cards as well, because I think you're not a magician really if you're... Now, some of the Tamariz has done other tricks, but primarily now he's a card magician. And there is always be a slight pullback, probably for me, for people who only perform with cards. It just kind of doesn't mesh with me very well, my idea of what a magician is. Now, as I get into the second part, there's a lot of bad in this book, I would think. A lot of terrible advice and things which, if somebody actually read this book and get a stellar review, I'd have to consider the fact that they're just full of shit, number one, and number two, that they maybe don't understand magic as well as they say they do. You don't need me to tell you this stuff, really. If you, as I've said many times on this podcast, if you just go and look and watch people perform, you will know whether this stuff is present in their work or it's not. There's been many people who have written, and I won't even go into naming them, I'm not out to slander anybody, but it's very easy to find out who's full of shit and who's not when you just go out, you read their books about theory, and then you go see them work, or you watch them work on video or whatever, and it's painfully obvious they're not putting into play exactly what they said they're doing. And magic is rife with people like that. Tamariz, though, I will give him credit, he's not like that. Because in this book, he's not telling you stuff that he doesn't actually do. In fact, he's justifying the way he does his magic, and that's perfectly fine. I happen to not agree with the way he does his magic. I happen to think he's not one of the best performers in magic. But he explains why, perhaps, in this book. So Tamariz, throughout parts of this book, goes into sort of heavy detail about, he believes the personality of the magician is the most important part. And of the 5 most important things, the presentation is the least important. Still important, he says, but the least of the 5. And my immediate reaction to that statement is that that's complete hogwash. Because although you can break them apart for the sake of discussion, let's say, really, if you're doing it right, the presentation is generated from the personality and the character, the persona of the magician. So in performance, those two things are so intermingled that it's impossible to split them apart. I mean, if you look at someone like Gazzo, for instance, because Tamariz goes through, he says the personality is the most important and that one of the biggest factors is likability. That the impression, the lasting memory that the audience takes away is one of likability. And I would say it is one of love, where they just love and they adore you. And you look at someone like Gazzo, a lot of his humor, of course, is part of the overall presentation of his show. It's also defines who his character or his persona is. And that's all generated from within, because that character is an extension of Gazzo, who he really is, which is the best way to do it, and which is the way Tamariz suggests. Tamariz does not suggest to make up a character like that's the opposite of your regular persona. And I would agree with that. The best aspects of the characters that have been created come from within. And that's something I talk about a lot in the Real Secrets of Magic course program I put together. Now, Tamariz's main idea here as to why he thinks, so I think those two ideas, so to go back, I think those two ideas are inseparable. Because the personality suggests the way you do the tricks and will suggest the way that you present them and what the presentations will be about. Now, Tamariz is not about adding dramatic structure, overlaying dramatic structure onto the actual tricks themselves. He believes the tricks should be done, for the most part, without extra dramatic structure. And he cites the Our Magic book, where Masculine goes into the story about how they did a play, and when they incorporated magic into a play, it didn't hit as hard as when the magic was by itself. And so Masculine made that mistake of taking away that the overlaying of dramatic structure hurt the magic, and Tamariz is citing that same example. And I think both those people make a huge mistake, because in the structure of a play, the play is the central aspect of it, right? And the magic is supposed to serve that. Whereas when you're doing magic and you're coming up with stories and presentations, they're reversed. So that doesn't work the same way, is basically what I'm saying. Because you then look around at all the best magicians, and they all have great presentations. So for Tamariz to suggest that is both erroneous in my estimation, and also kind of he's trying to justify the way he does stuff, which is fine because this is his book. So basically, a lot of this book too also has to do with the shaping of people's memories. And there's some great techniques, which I'll get into probably in part 3. I'll mention them a little bit more. There's some great techniques for altering the memories from a technical standpoint and from a verbal standpoint of how people think the trick went. But he completely ignores the fact that the presentation itself is the best way to alter the memory of the spectators. And I'll give you a good example. People never say to me, when I see them later, and it's not in a performance thing, but they have seen me do my street show, they never say to me, "Oh, the card changed in my hand," which is the finale to the show. What they scream at me is, "We went back in time." Well, why do you think that is? It was because the trick itself did not lend. They did not automatically take from the trick what was meant. I gave that to them. I gave the context for which it made sense through the presentation, right? And that's the part they remember. And this is why, for most magicians, if you see somebody says, "Oh, I went and saw a magician last night," and you ask them, "What did he do?" all they can say is like, "Well, he did some things with a rope and a coin, and then this bowling ball fell out of his hat." But they don't remember anything else about it. But if you have a good presentation, they can say, "Oh, I was his apprentice. He taught me how to do magic. And then he showed me that one day, if I continue to practice and train, I can reverse the flow of time," which is something actually somebody said to me one time. So that's all given to somebody. So you're giving them something to hang it on. And Tamariz doesn't really believe in that. Now, he goes on to sort of soften some of his opinions, because he points to the fact that so many of the best magicians, of course, do have great presentations. So you have to explain that away. If you're Tamariz and you don't have that, you have to explain that away. So one of the ways he explains it, saying, well, they tell a story before or after. Like if you see René Lavande, for example, do his 3 breadcrumbs trick, he does the trick a few times where he doesn't really say anything. He just puts 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and he does this sort of rapid fire thing where they keep coming back. And then he tells the story, and then he punctuates it with one final phase. That's a great presentation, though. But you can't just take out the story of the moon, my shadow and me, or whatever the one he uses for that, and have it be the same trick. It's just not. It's just not. And so Tamariz goes into the different ways you can combine dramatic structure. But I think the best way, and he does highlight this in the book, and really the only way you want to do it, is when the two are complementary. Like in that time travel piece I do at the end of my show, the whole dramatic structure of it is essentially the same as the original Triumph, because it's a version of Triumph. So it's essentially the original Triumph story. I've just altered it. I've changed, it's about Chicago now. It's still about people messing with the magician. Turns out it's a kid. There's a group of them. All these sort of things have been woven into it to set up the dramatic conclusion, which is we traveled back in time. And the conclusion of the trick is pointed up by the conclusion of the story. And those two things unite at the end. And that is what you want to do when you make a great presentation. You want to unite those two things because that adds meaning to it, hopefully, because you've given it a context. It has a much better hook than just, hey, let me show you a card trick. Then hopefully the story is entertaining unto itself. That's one thing Tamariz shows don't have at all. You don't learn anything else while the show is going on. All you see are the procedures, and then, this is why Tamariz goes shuffle, 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 and plays his invisible violin. Because there's nothing else there. There's no levels. There's not a lot of humor. There's no good storytelling. There's nothing. It's vacant of these deeper levels. Now, Tamariz attempts to defend this idea of really not having great presentations by suggesting that the tricks themselves are metaphors which people take away and that you don't need a presentation. And let me tell you, that does not happen for the vast majority of people. Tamariz is living in a fairy tale world. Maybe Spain is a fairy tale world. I don't know. I've never been there. But he is living, if he's performing for the public at large, then he's living in a fairy tale world if he thinks these people are taking away. If he thinks that somebody looks at an ambitious card routine and takes away some beautiful metaphor about freedom or ambition or whatever, then you are dreaming. Because that's not what people say. When there's no great presentation and you do like an ambitious card, they just can't say, I don't know how you're doing that. It's just a puzzle. If that were true, if merely doing the trick provided the metaphor, then everybody would just do the ambitious card the same way, and it would be just as beautiful. But of course, that doesn't happen. And that's idiocy to suggest that. It's just so plainly false that it's beyond even questioning how false it is. Because it's obviously some people's, David Regal's ambitious card is better than one that's just done plainly. It's just obvious. So to suggest that by Tamariz, I think is ludicrous. And really, I think reading into this book more, it's really just a justification of why he does it the way he does it. Because he doesn't have great presentation. So he has to put some sort of reasoning as to why he doesn't. So he has a whole list of metaphors of what all these tricks could mean and stuff in the book, which could give you which serve to give you good ideas for presentations. Because the other thing is, if you don't make decisions about how you're going to do stuff or what you want to say, like in the first episode or part of this series, The Good, episode 85, I put a little slice from the movie A Star Is Born where the main character there, Jackson Maine, says, Lots of people have talent. Lots of people can do cool stuff. In this case, lots of people are good at the tricks. But if you've got something to say, it's a whole different bag. And that's exactly this. That's exactly what Tamariz doesn't have. He doesn't have anything to say. His tricks are just tricks. He's a trickster, really, in my book, and not a magician. And so, and that's not magic. Tricks are not magic. Now, there'll be a few people, of course, who are sharp enough and sensitive enough to pick up on it, to imagine a metaphorical takeaway from just seeing a trick done in its most basic form. There are people who do that. But on a wide scale, that is not true in any way, shape, or form. And when you learn about marketing, you learn about how little people pick up from the communication. You know, they tell you to write at a grade level below grade 5. And even on this podcast, I've had people not understand when I say the word presentation what I mean. So for them to be able to look at an ambitious card and think some fantastic metaphor you're dreaming. You're living in a fairy tale world. It's not true. And whatever metaphor they're conjuring up in their head, if you haven't provided a context that you want to provide, then they're just taking some arbitrary metaphor, maybe one you don't intend. This is why you have to make conscious decisions with your show, because people are going to take away something from your show. And if you don't attempt to shape that and shape their memories, which is what Tamariz says you should be doing in here, incidentally, which is pretty ironic, then you're not in control of what they're taking away. Right? And that may be negative. In a lot of cases, it actually is, because people are not shaping that. And then he talks about this comet effect, which is this long-term memory and likability and shaping. Like, to me, the presentation clarifies what this is about. It improves the dramatization. There's not a trick where you say, this is a great trick, and I couldn't make it better with a presentation. It just doesn't exist. Because you could always put more meaning. It's exactly what Henning Nelm said. The difference between just a ham sandwich appearing in your pocket or someone saying you're hungry and you making a ham sandwich appear in their pocket. Now, what's even more ironic about this book and some of the vast contradictions. Now, as I understand it, this book was written over a long period of time. And I find that weird to sort of all put it together like that. But one of the things he mentions about classical tricks and why they're so, there's often repeatability in classic tricks, and that these tricks have stood the test of time. And then he refers to some of these tricks as these great metaphors, and he calls it the invisible deck. Yeah, well, guess what? The invisible deck is not the name of the trick. That's the presentation for the trick that somebody came up with, right? Isn't it ironic that in the course of discussing the minimizing in this book, which it is a minimizing of the need for presentation, he refers to the invisible deck, which is the presentation which has become so synonymous with that trick, so copied and plagiarized, the very things that Tamariz is supposedly speaking out against in this book, that he calls himself he calls it the invisible deck. But that's not the name of the trick. That's the name of the presentation somebody gave to it.
Come on, man.
So it's very ironic that he mentions like all these things and attempts to minimize the need for a presentation, and that the trick itself delivers these metaphorical presentations that are so beautiful. And then he calls it the invisible deck. What? I mean, you just proved to yourself how important a presentation. That presentation became so important. It's a presentation that 99% of people use, and that they call it that, and they sell it as that now. It's become so synonymous. And a lot of tricks are like that, actually. Right? I mean, Triumph, the name of the trick, is the presentation for the trick. The person tried to mess with you and you triumphed over them by using magic. So a lot of these things are commingled. So for Tamariz to try to downplay presentation is really just a defense, I feel, for the reason why his magic doesn't have great presentations. I mean, if I look at Tamariz's work, the one I like the best, perhaps, is Chanta the Chan, which I believe there was a show named that. So I'm not sure what that means in Spanish. I never looked it up. But it's a follow the leader effect where he uses the Chanta the Chan, Chanta the Chanta the Chan, Chanta the Chan, Chan, for why the cards, when you switch the leader cards, why the other cards switch with it, right? Follow the leader. And then he has this nice thing where he goes ching to ching when it's only one card instead of all the cards. And that's nice because it has a popular song that most people know, so it's easily relatable. It's a song which points up Juan Tamariz's character because he has this sing-songy, he's using the metaphor of music and music and magic together, which is hence why he plays his invisible violin. And so he believes that the magic is akin to music, is a music of mystery, let's say. But what else do we know about Juan Tamariz from his performances? Without reading more about him in his personal life, just from watching his performances, I would suggest that you know nothing about Juan Tamariz. Because there's no presentations, because he hasn't put any other fascinating ideas into his work, which leads you to know more and like him more. In fact, a lot of people don't like his presentation. When he's screaming and he's going all crazy, that can be funny and it's silly and I don't even mind that as much. As not my favorite thing, but all of that is just such a surface level thing, and it's really trying to stand in for any real work you should put in to your magic, which is to actually come up with why the hell you're showing people this stuff. So I find that very interesting that he didn't call it the Ultra Mental deck, which is what it is really called. And I think it was Eddie Fields who came up with the invisible cards idea, and then Don Allen really popularized that by giving it the whole rest of it. So, very interesting that the presentation is the one he chooses to call it. Now, I'm sure he never thought about that, but sometimes you don't see the irony in your own statements, right? Now, it may be that some people, like I said, very small percentage of people take this metaphorical wonder washes over them just for seeing the method on display, which is the trick itself without a presentation. But also, if it does do that, it must be fleeting, just like the surprise of doing a trick itself without a presentation. Because if you're just doing the trick itself, you can't give it any foreshadowing, you can't give it any backshadowing, you can't give it any bookending, you can't provide any meaning that you want to put into it. As an artist, the you have something to say aspect, you can't put that in if you just do the trick as it's written and just go through the motions. So it's really troubling that Tamariz would attempt to downplay that. What's another funny aspect of this book, and a lot of the Tamariz stuff has always been sort of flowery in its prose, and this book is no exception. He continues to say the presentation is the least important of the important things, but then he continues to describe the effects in the book with such phrases as a winged horse, the soul of the trick, right? Bringing the card to life. All of things which are metaphorical, which are a presentation for the writing. You didn't just say, and then the card came to the top, or the card joined back together. No, he said the soul of it brought it back to life by reattaching or whatever, right? All of which is a presentation for the writing itself. You can't get away from it. Having great presentations for stuff enhances everything. Why do you think when you go to a really good restaurant, they plate the food in a certain way? It's a presentation for the food. And to be ignorant of that or attempt to downplay it, I think is just reprehensible. Because you're leading people in the wrong direction. And you can choose, of course, to do your magic any way you want. But why wouldn't you attempt to make it, A, the best it could be, and B, infuse it with things that you want to say to give it the life that you as an artist want to give it. Not just leave it open to whatever wants to take away. Good artists shape the memories and the takeaways of the people. You know, if you watch these Star Wars movies, which I reference over and over again on this podcast, they don't just leave it open to interpretation. There's themes and stuff that have run through that entirety of this 8 movies that are out, and eventually will be a 9th. And there's even more movies than that, because of course there's standalone ones. But they contain these arcs and these themes of hope, for example, that run throughout the entirety of the Skywalker saga. That's not in there so that you can interpret it any way you want. That's George Lucas originally, and now Disney, attempting to speak to you on a certain level. They want you to take away something that is of they feel is important, right? So it's really interesting how Tamariz completely downplays that stuff. And I would also suggest, now he is suggesting in the book that the classics are the classics for a reason and blah, blah, blah. And you've heard this line of thing before. And a lot of the classics, of course, have repetition, and the old adage is you never repeat a trick and all this kind of stuff. And there's some good information in here about having multiple ways to do tricks and stuff of the same trick. But I would also suggest that the classics are the classics because it's monkey see, monkey do. People just copy what other people are doing. And in magic, magic has to be the worst case of this in history. Because people just copy lock, stock, and 2 smoking barrels, people's whole presentations. Hey, Invisible Deck, it's a good example. They do the same tricks, the same way, no presentation. I mean, how many people are doing like Vernon's Cups and Balls routine, or now Gazzo's Cups and Balls routine? Or how many people are doing, the Symphony of the Rings? Or Pop Hayden's comedy ring routine, right? How many people do those? I mean, magic has the worst case of like monkey see, monkey do ever, perhaps. And so one of the reasons why the classics are the classics is because everybody copies it. And what's interesting is you go back in the literature and you read about the history of magic, there's all sorts of little phases where tricks became really hot and like everybody did them. Like the vanishing birdcage is probably my favorite effect ever. And you go back into like turn of the 1900s when it became popular after Decolta invented it. People stole it. They attempted to buy it. And then by the time like the 20s and 30s rolled around, like every Tom, Dick, and Harry, you look at all the little, because they have in the old magazines, they have the, who did what at the assembly. At ring assembly number 10, who did what today? Joe Smith got up and did the linking rings, followed by the Invisible Deck, from Barney Miller. And then Teresa Miller got up and she did the vanishing birdcage, And for a while there, everyone, it got so bad in some cases when you read in the old periodicals that people, when they hired people, they say, okay, we'll hire you, but you can't do the vanishing birdcage, for example, or you can't do the linking rings, or you can't do the egg bag. They would purposefully ban tricks which had become so copied and hackneyed that they would ban you from performing them at certain locations or at certain events. So there's also a lot of, that's one reason classics are classics too, is that people just continue to copy what other people have done. So I think, by and large, because I could go on forever about why this is terrible, if you look at some of Tamariz's best routines, they're the ones that actually have presentations. I mentioned the Chanta de Chan, with the musical accompaniment. I mentioned there's the one where he does the corn winder car trick. That's one of his most memorable ones. And funny, it has a bit of a presentation to it. So, we've belabored this point on now 86 different episodes of the podcast. But in reality, there's no getting around. If you want your magic to be good, there's no getting around doing a presentation. And, he attempts to draw a distinction between all the other arts like film and literature and stuff, which he says are separate, and he makes that mistake of concluding what Maskelyne concluded. Guess what? Magic is fiction. This is something I covered on a number of podcasts as well. Right? If you really want it to be real and seem the quote unquote the realist, you would go into the world of charlatanry, where you pretend to be a psychic like John Edward, where you're attempting to prove that you are doing this for real, that you really do have psychic powers. That's not what magic is. Magic itself is a fiction. The only reason we know about magic is from fairy tales and myths. And if you look up the word myth in a dictionary, you know what it's going to say? It's a story. Right? Look it up. So this is why I've long said now, and as I said in the Tommy Wonder ones, where Tommy Wonder agreed, all those type things that you can use, that are used in literature, that are used in film, can also be used in magic. And guess what? Nobody's doing it. And that's why I was hoping when this book came out that Tamariz would talk about some of those things. But he doesn't. He doesn't think it's important. He doesn't think they're the same. They're exactly the same in many ways. And the way Tamariz suggests doing his show, which in Spain I believe they call like a session. I've heard Danny De Ortiz say, when I put together my sessions, so it's like shows, right? Linking all the tricks together. Like from someone who's been in magic so long, you'd think he would have picked up on that already. There should be themes and arcs throughout the entire show. But you watch Tamariz's show, there's none of that. And he doesn't link any of the there's no reasoning why he's showing us these tricks other than the fact that, hey, we're here to enjoy some magic, which is the worst possible reason to do it. And that's why this book is a complete failure and not only disappointing to me, but this section in particular about the theory of performing and presenting tricks and making them magical is a complete failure. And anyone who gave this book a good review, I mean, if you did it because you're a friend of Juan Tamariz, I can get that, because a lot of people will do that. But just on the merits of the actual stuff that's the actual ideas in it, it's an epic fail. This stuff has been said much better in books by people I've been mentored by, such as Eric Evans. In his book with Nowlin Craver called The Secret Art of Magic. Much better book in terms of some of this stuff. The Books of Wonder. This book doesn't even compare to the Books of Wonder, not in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't even compare really to our magic. So that's why I found this book very disappointing. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe he doesn't know how to weave that stuff together. Because when you get that stuff right, there's no trick you can't improve. So I think that's really all that needs to be said about this section. I had a bunch of notes here. I don't really need to go into much more. I mean, I've talked about this on different podcasts, but the greatest form of misdirection is the presentation itself. Something Tamariz doesn't seem to understand. And so the ultimate takeaway from this show, which he does, and I'll give credit to Tamariz for this, he does point up why he thinks this, and that's because he gives there's a chapter where he talks about what he personally likes, and he likes tricks done without a presentation. He just says it right in there. So basically this whole book is of a justification for what he personally likes, and that's fine. But that doesn't make it good. And that's why I don't consider Tamariz one of the greats. It's that simple. And it's a shame because he's such a big force and looked upon for direction. And he's giving the wrong direction. And there's minor things, of course, that annoy me. You know, when you have... This is something that annoys me. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on the podcast in bold relief. But when people, you know, when there's tricks where people say, pick a number between 5 and 10, and there's no justification why you're narrowing it down to, why isn't it 1 to 10? Why isn't it 1 to 20? Why is it between 5 and 15? Or there's lots of tricks that have this component in them. Lots of card tricks, actually, that have this component in them with no justification whatsoever. And it's one of the worst. It just, when I hear that and I see it, and there's an example in this book that does that, that just fucking annoys me. Because it's a simple thing to eradicate, first of all. And then second of all, it's just dumb. It's like, oh, between 5 and 10? Well, obviously you want me to pick it can only be in this range. I mean, it's so stupid to say, to do stuff like that. It's no different than tricks where, what is it? The Biddle trick, for example, where a person has picked a card and then you say, okay, I think it's one of these 5 cards, right? And you've already found it. You've narrowed it down to 5. You basically found it. And there's no justification for why it just ends up in these 5 cards. You know, it's stuff like that that's just idiotic and just makes for horrible, horrible magic. And it's ironic that Tamariz suggests that the ultimate sin is making it monotonous and boring. That's the ultimate sin of a magic trick, is making it monotonous and boring. Which is why I presume he goes, shuffle, because he's attempting to inject excitement into something which is inherently boring, right? Well, then why don't you just give it a presentation, dude? Why don't you just get serious and actually make something of that trick? Already gone on for 45 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up by saying, and I don't want to belabor the point anymore, but it's just... silly to avoid. I mean, but this is Tamariz's book, so he can do whatever he wants. He's free to say whatever he wants. He's free to have his own opinion. His magic actually matches what he says, which is rare. So I will give him mucho credit for that. But otherwise, I think this theory part of the book is a huge failure, massive failure, and a complete missed opportunity to help people make better magic. And so with that, that's it for episode 86. I'll be back again with the ugly. This wasn't ugly enough. With the ugly, which will be a little lighter tone, next week with episode 87. Until then.